So this is the third in the JavaScript series, and I'm not going to recap everything we did last time. I am going to make a folder for this time, so if you haven't done that yet, feel free to follow along. Same instructions as the previous times, so I'm just going to create a folder called, we'll be very creative and we'll call it session 3. And then when I right click, remember that you can open a terminal that is right in that folder, which is the easiest way of doing it. So just do open and integrate terminal. And that gives me a terminal that is inside of the session 3 folder, which we now want to turn into a Node.js project. And in order to do that, I will also create a new file in there first, and we'll call this again, if my typing wants to succeed, index.js. So this is an JavaScript file now. And oh, it wasn't working because I was typing in the wrong window. That doesn't help. And I will just put one statement in there. So we have a folder, we have a file in that folder, and I'm going to turn it into a Node.js project by doing npm init. And then we know from previous times that all of the answers here are fine. And is this okay? Yes. So basically, if you called your JavaScript file that we have here, if you gave that the name index.js, then all the defaults are acceptable for npm init. And that should give you a package.json with that stuff in it. And I'm going to do one addition to that as we did previous times. So add a comma to start a new script. And then the script will be dev. And if you remember from last time, that was the Nodemon application to monitor for JavaScript changes. And I'm going to do index.js, so the same file as we just created in there. So that I will add, and that way I have two scripts defined, one called test that doesn't do anything, and one called dev, which we are going to use here. Now, we also need the Nodemon application, and that was npm install Nodemon, and it is a development link, not a production link. So I can run that. And if I want to make sure, I can do npm install or npm update, and I should actually be completely set. Now, how do we run Nodemon? We don't. We have added a script here, and the script could be run by saying npm run, and then you need the name of the script that we just wrote. So in this case, npm run dev, and there we go. And as you can see, what it writes out at the bottom is penguins, which is the single line that we added to our JavaScript file. So we're all set up. And from this point on, if you do, and this is the point of all this magic, from this point on, if you do a modification and you hit Command S, it will rerun the index file, and you can immediately see what happens here, which is great for testing purposes. Now, I was told that I type very fast and that it's hard to keep up. So I will probably still type just as fast today, but if it's necessary, I'll try to leave some time in between my typing. You don't have to follow along with this just yet, because this is just a small recap, and I want to position what we did. I have a presentation for this, but interestingly, it's only like 5 slides or something, and I don't really think I need it. I will try to upload it to the Facebook group afterwards, but as I was told in the beginning, I forgot to do that last time, so my promise carries a little bit less weight this time. We'll see. So what we did last time was variables, an introduction of variables, and the way I showed that is I can do something like this. You had multiple ways of declaring a variable, and remember I talked about a variable as a box in which you can put some stuff, which is a very nice way of representing that. And it has a name. In this case, the name is animal. You could also use var or const. Const is for variables that don't change. Var is when you have the misfortune of using an older JavaScript interpreter like what you have inside of Switch. If you have the possibility to use let, then let or const, depending on whether you want to modify it or not afterwards, are definitely the best to use, because let also gives you some further protection over using var. That's what we saw last time. Now let's take this one step further. Let's say that I'm talking about animals that someone has, or favorite animals someone has. And instead of only allowing one, I want to allow multiples. And the way to do that is I can, of course, define multiple variables. And you still don't necessarily have to type along with me. And I think this is also something that I did in the homework. You can define multiple variables, and then I can store multiple favorite animals of someone. And instead of doing it on 2 separate lines, what I'm doing here is I'm declaring 2 variables called animal1 and animal2, and I'm using this comma in between. If you start despairing about all the new stuff in terms of syntax, try to see that there are things that come back the whole time. This comma notation of separating multiple items, for example, is something that in JavaScript comes back all the time. So once you understand that that is what it's used for, you can even try to guess new syntax. So this is of course great. I have now a way to store multiple animals, but it still has limits. What do I have to do if I want to store 10 animals? Well, I would have to create 10 variables. I guess I could still do that, but it gets boring very quickly. Even worse, what if I have to do if I don't know how many animals I want to save? There is a little quiz. I want to ask people what their favorite animals are, and I don't know in advance how many there are. So how do you deal with that? And the way to deal with that in JavaScript is a new concept, and the concept is the concept of an array. And an array, well, if a variable is a box, think of an array as a box that has subdivisions. So rather than just being able to put one thing in there, I can put multiple things in there. I can declare an array quite easily. And now if you want, you can start following along, because now we're going to do new stuff. But I can declare an array very easily. It also has a name. It is a variable after all. So, but because of the subdivisions, I'll use the name animals for it, because I can store multiple things in there. And the way that is declared is by using a square bracket. Yeah? And so at the moment, I have an array that is empty. Simply by using the square brackets, I'm telling JavaScript that, look, this is not a regular variable like a string or a number or undefined or null or infinite, but this is a subdivided box, if you want. And what happens when I write this out? Well, you can see at the bottom that JavaScript on the console will also write out this variable in this kind of notation. So it shows me that, yes, this is an array, and it's empty, there is nothing in there. And of course, I can make it more interesting by immediately when I declare this array, by also storing things in there. And what do you know, I can just type that in between these brackets. So I can put a string in there. Remember what I said about the comma being used to separate stuff? Well, I can use that as well. And I can add as many of these things in there as I want. And when I write it out now, this is also exactly what is written by JavaScript. Yeah, I have an array, and there are 3 items in that array. And of course, the advantage is that I don't have to declare multiple variables. It's only one variable, and the variable is called animals. And now I can put as many of these things. If I want to add another 20 animals, then I can. It's not a problem from that point of view.
Sorry, David, is there a reason why you had, I mean, when you define that you had double quotes, but in the array, it's single quote?
You mean here at the bottom?
Yeah.
No, so in JavaScript, it can be double quotes or single quotes. My Prettier plugin enforces double quotes here. So even if I wanted to be different or original, I'm pretty sure, see, it changes them back as soon as I save. And the reason it's here written out by single quotes is because for some reason the console uses single quotes as a, well, as its standard. So it is different between the two, but
okay.
It
So
difference.
That doesn't mean that this has anything to do with the array itself. It's just the way the console shows it, but inside, basically it's a string which is penguin and another string which is rabbit, etc. Okay.
Correct.
Thanks.
It probably uses some kind of function internally to convert it into a string and then writes it out, and it comes out as single quotes. I could use single quotes here as well, but my Prettier plugin is not set up for that. So,
okay, thanks.
Now, writing out or dealing with this whole array is probably not the most interesting bit. What is the most interesting bit is that we could say, well, no, I don't want all the animals. I just want the first animal from this array, right? That would be more interesting because I want to be able to access them individually. How do I do that? Well, let me put it into the console log. You do that with the same square bracket notation. And I could say console log 1, yes? So let's save that. When you look at what is written out, it then writes out this polar rabbit thing. Now, this is, of course, very interesting. And this is also, I think, the quote that I put on the event for today. Real programmers start counting at 0. This is what happens in JavaScript arrays. This is not the same in every language, but in most languages I've seen, it is actually done this way. So the first element in the array, what we think of when we speak English as the first element, is actually 0. And you can kind of get around that in your head if it causes you headaches by thinking of this as the first element is the element with index 0. So the indexes into the array start at 0. And this is annoying first one, or to know which one you want. It's also annoying when you start thinking of, okay, and how does that correspond to how many items we have in there? Because of course, you'll also have to take that into account. So arrays always, or better said, array indexes always start at 0. So here we have an array. This is index number 0, this is index number 1, and this is index number 2. And it is an array with 3 items in it. if you start doing stuff with that, the fact that you have to start counting at 0 is something you get used to. And in many cases, it's actually useful that you start counting at 0. It makes some calculations easier. It also makes others more difficult. I shouldn't beat around the bush when it comes to that. Now, this is how you access the value of a particular element of the array. We have the name of the array and then square brackets and then the index into the array. How do I do assignments? When I have a regular variable, this animal variable I have there, I can say this. This is what we saw last week. I can just assign a new value to my variable. Can I do that with an array? Well, of course you can. An array is just a variable by itself, so I can just assign something new to it. So I could say other animals. I chose all kinds of weird stuff here. Programming is more fun if there are dinosaurs involved, so I can reassign that. Now, you have to be very aware of what we're doing here. Animals is an array with 3 elements in it. And what I'm saying here is that animals is now an array with 4 animals. So this array is now gone. I've overwritten it by a new array in animals. So if I write it out, and I will do the programmer thing here and just copy paste. If I write this out, you can see that my animals array is now this ant, aardvark, however you pronounce that, T-Rex and panda. Yeah. The variable still has the same name, animals, but the value of it is now a different array with different animals inside. This is, of course, not always what you want to do. Sometimes I know I have an array with stuff in it, and I just want to replace one element in it. Well, as I said before, once you know a particular piece of syntax, you can bet on it that it's going to be used in the same way over and over again. So if I do animals 0, and I assign something to it, then this is the syntax to modify one element. So originally it was defined as an array and the first element was an ant. And now I changed that first element, remember, index 0. I changed the first element to penguin. Yeah. So I can either modify the value of the variable as a whole, and in that case, I am overwriting whatever array I had previously, or I can decide to change the value of one of the elements inside that array. So the whole array remains the same. In this case, I just modify the first element inside. Now, in case you are thinking that there is some kind of magic going on here and that this animals thing being an array always has to be an array, of course not. JavaScript doesn't care about type. We saw that last time. So if I do this, then now my variable animals is a number. So the second array is also gone. It is now just a number. So there is no magic to this. Simply by defining or declaring a variable with a particular name as an array, well, then it's an array. If I want to redefine it as a number or a string, then it's a number or a string. Okay. How do I figure out how many animals I have in my array? And in order to figure that out, we're going to introduce a new thing, and that is called a property. Take one step back, an array in JavaScript that's the theoretical explanation, and we'll see what real objects are in a second as well. But an array in JavaScript is a type of object, and an object in JavaScript can have properties and methods, and a method is a function. We'll see all these things again, so don't worry. What is a property? Well, property for a JavaScript object is exactly the same as a property in English. I have a car. Property of my car is that it has 4 wheels, at least most of the time when nothing goes wrong, it has 4 wheels. Yeah? My car is blue. That's another property. It's the same is true for objects in JavaScript. And because an array is a special type of object, JavaScript has also given it a property. And we can use properties in JavaScript by doing something that we're going to do a lot. And actually, you've already seen it used, and that is the dot notation. And you've seen that when we do console.log. That's a way to call a method or a function of the console object. And when I want to access a property of animals, which is an array, I can do the same thing. So animals dot, and then there is this property called length, as you can see there. What do I do with that? Well, I can put it in a variable. So number of animals. And we declare the variable number of animals, and the value that we put inside is the value of the property called length of the variable animals. And when I write that, the trick to typing very fast is to use autocomplete in Visual Studio Code, of course. So when I write that out, what I get is 4. Yeah? So any array that you create in JavaScript automatically, magically gets a property called length that is always there. It is baked into the language. And that length property, when I ask for it and I put it into a variable, that variable is now the length of the array. And I had 4 elements in here. I have overwritten one of them, but that does not change the length of the array. So the length here writes out as 4. Okay. So let's do something really strange here. Sometimes JavaScript is like philosophy class. This is going to be one of those. So I'm going to do a console log. And I'm going to use our square bracket notation to get an element from the array. And I want the element with index 4. Now, count with me. 0, 1, 2, 3. You'll agree with me that there is no subdivision, there is no index element with index 4. We only go up to 3. So what is the answer going to be that JavaScript gives when you ask for element number 4? In many other programming languages, the answer would be a crash or some kind of warning from the compiler or the interpreter that tells you that you weren't paying attention and that doesn't exist, so I'm going to crash. JavaScript, as we've seen last week as well, has a tendency not to crash, but just give some kind of answer. Yeah? I already expressed that I don't think that's a good idea, but it is what happens, and it's important that you realize that. And if you run this, what you get is undefined. So what is the value of a subdivision in this box that doesn't exist? The answer is undefined. And then there is some kind of logic to that if you think about it. Yeah. So I can ask for the value of any item in there. And if that item doesn't exist in the array, even if it's far beyond the bounds of this array, the answer is going to be undefined. This is a little bit dangerous, but it's what happens. Now let's do something else that is interesting. I'm going to remove this one. We don't need it really. Well, I'll just leave it here. Let's do something that is even more trippy. going to redefine one of these array elements. So if I would change the element with index 3, that is actually the 4th element, and I would change the value of panda. Now I'm not going to do that. I'm going to change the value of the element with index 5. Now that's really strange. If you do this in a C or a C++ program, you probably don't get an error, but your program will crash probably about 10 minutes later because you're overwriting memory that is not yours at that point, or at least you might be. JavaScript deals with that differently. So I have this array 0, 1, 2, 3. Number 4 didn't exist. We just saw that because it returns undefined. And I'm actually putting something in subdivision number 5, index number 5. Yeah. Does that crash? Of course not. This is JavaScript. We don't crash unless we have to. So let's write out the array again. And now what you've created is what JavaScript calls, and they even have a name for it, is a sparse array. So I have an array with index 0, 1, 2, 3, index 5, and element with index 4 doesn't exist. That's a hole in the array, basically. JavaScript is completely fine with that concept. So if I would put something in an element with index 1000, it would basically create 900 and whatever empty values for me. And then my array would have something in the slot for element 1000. So this is completely fine for JavaScript. In most cases, I try to avoid this because it's one thing to put an element in there, but of course you will have to deal with the fact that there is now an empty slot in the middle of your array. And that's just a complication that is sometimes better to avoid. So can you do this? Yes, you can do this. Should you? Probably not unless you know very well what you're doing. Okay. So how do I put things into my array? Well, I could do that by saying animals 4 is something. And why 4? Well, because I know that my array here has 4 elements. So 0, 1, 2, 3, remember? So I know that if I do 4, it's at the end of the array. I'm disregarding this crazy bit for a second. Let's make a new array. So let's say animals equals this, meaning I'm going back to making it an empty array. And if I write it out, you can see that it's back to empty now. And of course, now I could do the same thing. I could say animals it's empty. So if I do 0, I'm already wrong. I have to do, if I do 1, I'm wrong. I have to do 0. And now I can put something in there. And any empty array needs a penguin at the front. So I'll just do animal 0 is penguin. I can do that, but keeping track of how many elements in there and then remembering that where I need to put this one is a little bit difficult. I could try to do something smarter and I could think, well, I have a property that is called length, and length tells me how many items I have in the array. So I could use that. So instead of 0, I could just use the property. Of course, when I'm using the property, the answer right now would be 0 because it's an empty array. And that would be exactly what I'm looking for in a way. So when I save this, I start with an empty array. And then I say animals, which animal? Well, the one at animals.length, which is 0 because my array is empty, is now going to be penguin. So animals.length because length is obviously starts counting at 1. If I have an empty array, length is going to be 0, but an array with 1 element in it is going to return 1. An element with 2 elements in it is going to return 2. When you translate, when you use that as an index, that is always just beyond the values that I have. So this is a way, a generic way to put additional stuff into my array. Yes? This is not very nice, is it? I mean, I have to type animals twice and so on, and this is very, very boring. So it's also very tiring, and I'm a developer, so I don't want that. So what we're going to do is we're going to use, instead of using this bracket notation, we're going to use a function for this array. And I called them properties and methods. A method is a function that is connected, built into an object. And arrays have, well, not lots, but they have some built-in functions in JavaScript. You access them by using the dot notation. Again, as I said, just the same for console dot something. And when I do animals dot, Visual Studio Code already knows that I'm working with an object. It knows it's an array, and so it will show me all the methods that are available for that array. And the one I'm interested in is push. Because push is something that adds stuff into my array. How does it do that? Well, a function, normally you have the name of the function followed by brackets, parentheses, as I do here. And then for push, I have to give it an argument. An argument is like an input to a function. And the argument is what I want to put in my array. So if I want the first element to be penguins, this is how I would type that. I do animals.push and then what I want to put in. Now, I can do that multiple times. And then while we're doing it multiple times, I can also show you that it doesn't always have to be strings. I can have an array with multiple different things in there as well. So each time I call push, something gets put into my array. And push treats an array like a stack. What is a stack? Well, you can eat a stack of pancakes or something similar. And that means that items on a stack go on top. So when I do push, the thing I push is added at the end of the array. That's what that means. Okay, now something like push has an input that you give, but it also has an output, a return value as that is called. Yeah. And what is the output from push? The output is the number of elements that you have in your array when you complete the push. So if I would also write out that, what it's going to give me is 2. Once more, I am calling push, and it puts something into my array. I'm calling push again. It is putting something else on my in my array. And this time I use the return value as well. I put that in a new variable, and when I write that out, the answer will be 2. So from a terminology point of view, an object, and an array is a type of object, can have properties, and I access them through the dot notation. An object can also have methods or functions that are built into it. I access those also using the dot notation. And a function can have an input and an output. And in JavaScript terminology, that is called parameters, input parameters. In our example, what we want to put in our array, and return values. That's the output. And the return value and the input parameters are, of course, different from function to function. Each function that you use, you will have to give it different things. You have functions where you give it nothing, and you will be able to get back different things. And normally the documentation of the function will tell you what the input and what the output is. And when you look at this for push, for example, you can see that it says methods, push accepts some items in this case, and it gets back a number. Yeah. And you have the documentation there as well that says appends a new element or multiple new elements to the array, and it returns the new length of the array. So the length of the array after the push that we did. Okay. And as you can see as well, you don't have to use the return value in JavaScript. It is not required. Push can also be used this way, where we simply ignore the return value. It's still there. JavaScript will still return it, but we simply ignore it. Whether you ignore it or not depends on whether you actually need the return value or not. Does that make sense? Any questions? No, makes total sense. Good. Last thing for this array, and then we're going to go to the second bit of this class. Of course, if I can add stuff, it would be interesting to also be able to remove stuff. And there are more interesting things that arrays can do, and we will get back to many of those. But let me just show you the removal thing quickly. So that would be animals, again, dot. And I get my list of functions again that are supported. And in this case, I can use pop. That kind of makes sense. If I have push to put something in my array, I have pop to put something out of my array. And pop returns the last value, the last element from the array, as you can see. Yeah. And it also returns something. And what it returns is the animal that was popped from my array. Well, in my case, we're putting also numbers in this array. So if I write this out and I say save, and you run that, then the return, actually I shouldn't only do that, I should also show you what the return value is. Yeah, so what we see already here is penguins and 42. 2 was the return value of the push that we did. And then after the pop, my array goes back to 1 element. And when I run the last bit, the popped animal variable is now set to 42. Why? I've called pop. Pop returns the value that it removes from the array. My array contained penguins and 42, and this 42 is now removed and ends up in my variable that I have there. What is the important bit to remember here? Well, first of all, you have something that is called an array. It is a type of object. We haven't defined what an object is, but we'll do that in a second. It's a type of object, and that type of object has properties. Actually, it has one property most of the time, and that is length, which gives you the amount of elements in an array. And it has a bunch of methods that you can call. And these methods do things like pushing and popping elements in and out of the array. But it also can do all kinds of other things. You have a method that does sorting, for example, or filtering arrays, and you have all kinds of interesting methods that modify this array in certain ways. So that's when you want to work with a list of items, and then you get an array and life is good. So let me, well, no, we'll let it exist. It's okay. Second bit. I've mentioned the word object a couple of times. An object is, and let me first do the thing we're not going to do. An object is an answer in JavaScript to a different question. You don't have to type this along because it's a nonsensical approach to it. So let's say that we want to keep some information, and it's information that belongs together for some reason. So how do we keep track of that? And what I could do is I could create multiple variables for that. Who is the partner of Donald Duck? That's actually Daisy Duck. They have the same last name. I don't know whether they are married or not. And it was not a trivial question. I looked it up on the internet. So what if I want to store multiple things about a cartoon character? Things like first name, last name, the partner that they have if they have one. Of course, I can create multiple variables. This is not a very interesting approach. We just saw an approach that we might use for this. So if you only have a hammer, then everything is a nail. That's the saying. So I could say, well, let's put this stuff in an array. We just explored this and this kind of fun. So let's just all put all of that stuff about this cartoon character in an array. And this solves one problem. It also introduces others. It solves one problem. And the problem is that, well, multiple variables are annoying, and an array is a way to group things together. And now I have one cartoon character and I have all the data together in an array. So that problem is solved. Unfortunately, this is not very useful because now if I somehow want to have the first name of Donald Duck, I have to use this this square bracket notation, and I would have to write cartoon array 0. And what that means, and believe me, it's not very practical because I've done it. Sometimes you're lured into doing things that are not smart. What that means is that if every time I now want to use the first name of a cartoon character, I have to remember that the first name is stored in this array as item number 0, and I have to get it out that way. So whenever you're accessing this or you're updating it, you have to remember which index corresponds to what concept. And that's guaranteed to cause problems. Yeah. I don't care how logical you think this is or that you're doing it, sooner or later, you're going to trip yourself up. So that's not a good approach. I don't like that. What is a better approach? A better approach is to use actual objects for this. And now JavaScript is a language that where objects were not defined very, well, not in the beginning anyway. And so they have a less structured approach to it than some other languages, but we can still do something like this. And now you can start to follow again if you want. And we're going to declare an object. We'll give that object the name famous duck. And how do you declare an object? You declare an object by using not square brackets, but curly braces. Yeah? Writing software code is a good way to figure out where all the strange characters on your keyboard are. If you're on a Mac and you don't know how to do this, usually it is Option or Alt and then a regular parenthesis, the regular parentheses. So an object is defined with these curly braces, and instead of having just a list and indexes, now I can do something more interesting, and I can define properties. So I can say, well, this duck has a property that is called first name. That is logical, and that in this case is Donald. Yeah. So rather than using an index, I'm going to use something that has a name. What if I want multiple properties? As I said before, you keep seeing the same thing over and over. Multiple properties are divided by commas. And now I know how to create as many of them as I want. And I can write this in a much better way by doing this. Yeah. So I have one object, and the object has properties. When I save this, you'll see two strange things, I think. The first one is that it changed the indentation again, but as I said, that's because Prettier thinks that this is good. And the second one, and this is much more disturbing, is that it also added a comma at the end. This is allowed in JavaScript. And the reason that Prettier does this for me is because if I now want to add an additional property, like age, what is the age of Donald Duck? No one knows. If I add another property, I can do that without any problem. Yeah? Properties are subdivided by commas. If I have a comma at the end, that is not a problem, but if I would forget a comma in the middle somewhere, that is a problem. And actually, it even causes a crash when I try to save it. So to be on the safe side, Prettier decides that in object definitions like this, it is also going to add commas after the last element, which makes it, well, less risky to add elements at the end afterwards. But strictly speaking, the comma is not necessary. The comma is to subdivide this thing into multiple properties. I can't avoid it. Every time I save, it's going to add it. Now, this is a very nice way to put things together, but now, of course, we need to know how we use that. And we use it in exactly the same way as we used the length property of an array. You already know what the syntax is. So I could say, let's age equal famous duck dot age. Yeah. And now age will be 25. If I want to access the first name, then it would be dot first name. Assignments are exactly the same. I can say famous duck dot age equals 26. Nothing strange there. And when I want to add this into a sentence, for example, if I want to write something out, I could, again, using something that we have seen last time, which is this strange backwards tick character, I could say the age of Donald is, and using a template string, I can insert variables in there. And that should write out the age of Donald is 26. It was 25, I modified it to 26, and then I'm writing it out and I'm getting a nice string. So what is the difference between an array and a regular object? Well, in an array, I can access elements by using this square bracket notation, and I use an index. I say element number 0 or 1 or 2. In an object, I don't use the indexes to get to something. I'd rather get or use their properties. If you start learning more or reading more about JavaScript, you'll see that I can actually also do it differently. So instead of saying famous duck age, and I don't want to completely confuse you, and I'm not going to do it again afterwards, but I can also do this, and that gives me exactly the same result. Yes, and this shows you a little bit that there is a connection between arrays and objects, that deep down for JavaScript, all of them are objects. An array is just a special type of object that is defined in the JavaScript language. But so this bracket notation can also be used for objects, except that you're not using an index in that case, but you're using the name of the property. And sometimes that is useful. In many cases, and at least for now, you can just as well forget about that and remember that for objects, you use dot notation to access them. Good. This thing that we saw here, we actually already saw that in use in a way, because if you look at this package.json, that is very similar. A JSON is, as I said in the first class, it stands for JavaScript object notation. So it's a way to, in a textual format, write a JavaScript object, and you can see that it's exactly the same as what we have here. The only difference is that here the properties also, the name of the properties also has that. But when I save this, Prettier removes that. So that would be allowed in JavaScript as well, but it's not necessary. You can write it without. So this is the preferred way of writing that. Well, this doesn't have to be very simple or as simple. I can mix different concepts together. So I can say something like, well, maybe my cartoon characters have, well, that's a bit weird to call it that. I think I came up with a better name. Yes. So, but I could say, well, maybe this thing has animals. And if I were Donald Duck, I would want a penguin. And maybe some other animals. So you can mix these two concepts. I can have an object where one of the properties is an array. And as we will see at some point as well, you can have the opposite as well. I can have an array that stores not strings, but that stores objects inside. Yeah. So if I would define an array called cartoon characters, remember it's an array, so I define it with this square notation. I can put my famous duck in that array, and that's no problem at all. And now I have an array that has an object inside, and that object has an array inside. And I don't know whether the console is still going to be very happy to write this out, but we'll see. Yes, it does. So I have an array, and in the array I have an object, and in the object I have an array again. So you can make these things as complex as you want, or as complex as you need them to be. Okay. We're just about at 1 hour, and I think I have one concept that I want to show you in order to completely confuse you. It is something that Peter Kleinheider brought up last class, I think. And it's kind of important to understand because it's a key concept in JavaScript and something to get wrong very, very easily. So let's give ourselves some speed here, or some speed, some size, some space. So I'm going to declare a new object to leave behind all the animals for a change. And I'm going to do something that is a const. Doesn't matter, it could be a let as well, but I'm not intending to change it. So I'm going to declare a constant variable that is called current temperature, and the current temperature is an object, and that object has a property called the value of the temperature, and we're going to give it a scale as well. So scale means, am I using Celsius or Fahrenheit or Kelvin? I'm a physicist, so when I tell you what the temperature is, it should have a scale with it, or it's useless. Yeah, so this is an object. We know it's an object. Why? Because it has been defined using these curly braces things. It has two properties. One of the properties is called value. The other one is called scale. And that means I can do all the things I've done before. So I can write out any part of this by saying console log and then current temperature value, for example. And when I write that out, it will tell me 25. When I don't add a property at the end and I write out current temperature, then on the console, I will see the whole object. And that's where we're going to leave this. Can I modify this? Of course I can modify this. I can say current temperature value is 28. It's gotten warmer. And when I write this out again, and trust me, there is a point to what I'm doing here, I hope. When I write this out again, I now have 28 there. Okay. So let's do something interesting here. Let's define a new temperature variable. Yeah, so we understand how this works, right? I have a variable that is an object. I put 25 into the property called value, and then I'm modifying that. And now I'm going to create a completely new variable, and I am going to put my current temperature in there. And we'll log that one to, I'm going to do this the developer way now, and I'm going to be very lazy. So I'm just going to copy paste a bunch of stuff that I want. There. So I declare a new variable called new temperature. And I say the value is current temperature. And then I'm going to write out new temperature. Yes? Not difficult. What is this going to give in the console? Well, it's going to give me 28C because new temperature was initialized with the value of current temperature, correct? Now comes the interesting bit. I have this new temperature thing, and I am going to change the value to 35 now. And now I want to see both of these. So the question is, when I now change new temperature value to 35, what happens to my two objects that I had defined? And the answer is, when I write that out, both of them are now 35. This is perhaps, depending on how you think about this, a little bit unexpected, because remember what I did here. I have a variable called current temperature, and I put something in it. It was 28 at the end. Then I take that and I put it in new temperature, and I modify new temperature, and for some reason current temperature also changed. The reason for that is what is normally referred to as value and reference. Yeah? And what it means is that when I write something like this, what I'm doing is not, think of the boxes again. Current temperature is a box, and in this case there are two items in the box, one called value and one called scale. New temperature is also a box. You have to think of object variables as something that points to a box. That's the best way to think about it. Yeah? And when I say I'm going to take current temperature and assign it to new temperature, I'm not taking the items from the box current temperature and putting a copy inside of new temperature. No, I'm just telling JavaScript that I want a new variable, and it needs to point to the same place as where the variable current temperature is pointing. So in reality, there is only one box, but these two things are pointing to it. So if I modify the box afterwards, well, I'm modifying both of these variables because they both point to that box. Yeah? That's the difference between value and reference. An object, and an array is an object as well, so it holds for that as well. Objects and arrays are copied by reference. If I do a statement like this, where I do a copy from one to the other, I am only copying the reference to that thing. I am not copying the thing itself. And this is, of course, quite important, because when I start doing things, assigning one variable to another, it is important to know whether you are creating a copy of the variable that is independent of each other, or whether you are just copying the reference to that variable, and when you modify one, the other one is going to be modified as well. Remark that this is different than what you do with regular strings, for example. String 1 is penguin. String 2 is something else. Is string 2, that is absolutely fine. I can do that. Yeah, I'm running out of animals now. Yeah, this is going to, if you would write out what string 1 and string 2 are now, this is going to behave completely different, because string values are copied by value. So when I say assign string 2 to string 1, what I'm saying is assign the value of string 2, which is ostrich, and put that in string 1. And if I then change the value of string 2, it is not going to affect string 1, because strings are copied by value. If I do the same thing with an array or an object, then I'm copying it by reference. And so modifying one will afterwards also modify the other. Does that make sense? This is what I wanted to cover today. The last bit, even if you say it makes sense now, if you've not done development before, I can guarantee you that it's one that's going to bite you at some point. Guaranteed. Yeah. I will try to come up with some homework that plays with this.
Before you bite us,
yes.
How would you copy the current temperature to new temperature to make it independent? Not the reference, but the value.
Yeah, so you would have to copy individual properties in that case.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and there probably are, I haven't looked, but I'm not going to give you the syntax right now. There is syntax in more modern versions of JavaScript to do this.
So it's not that obvious.
It is not that obvious, and it's mostly not that obvious because in the original JavaScript specification, that was not part of it. But there are ways of doing stuff like that. For arrays, it's well, there are ways to do it as well. But if we do some of the more advanced stuff around ES6, and when we talk about destructuring, then you'll see that there are ways to do this, very clever ways to do it, actually. Now, it is not needed all that often. That is one thing. I mean, mostly it's not really an issue. And actually, the fact that this happens can be really, really useful. And we'll see, once we start talking about functions and so on, you'll see that there are reasons that this is very useful.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so what have we seen? Arrays for lists and storing multiple values and accessing them with an index. And we've seen objects that store things, but not with indexes, but in a way where you have named properties. And to store, this is a concept that is very useful. It's a concept that in JavaScript, like I said, it was there in the original version of the language, but it wasn't used all that often. It is something that is used much more in Node.js style JavaScript and ES6 stuff. Node.js uses this quite often for all kinds of different things. And if you look at really modern JavaScript, there is one step beyond this. Most programming language, modern programming languages these days have a concept that is called class. And JavaScript now also has that, but that's then one step beyond this as well. For now, just remember that there is a concept called an array that you can use to store multiple things with an index. There is something like an object where you can give things a name and you can combine these two and you can use them to store all the information you need to store. So basically what we have seen is how to store simple variables. We've seen how to store more complex variables now. And what we can do next time is start looking at how to do actual useful stuff with these things. We know how to store things. We need to look at more detail at how do you do something with it? Calculations of things is the simple bit, but also how can you make functions that make use of things? And then we'll also need to look at control statements like if, then, and loops, and all that very interesting stuff. But this gives us a good foundation to store things and know how to deal with that part. And quite a bit of syntax already. I keep saying that, and I know that you probably have doubts by now, but the syntax that you see will, you will see that come back in many cases. And there are not that many different types of syntax in JavaScript. So we've seen a great deal of the different forms of syntax that we will encounter over and over again as we go along. Okay, that's it for me for now, unless someone wants to ask questions or has some doubts on something I went over, I think I covered everything I wanted to cover, and it is a little bit closer to 1 hour than last time, so that is good as well. Great. Go have a drink and have fun. See you next time.